Good morning.
Good morning. Marjorie?
How are you, Jason?
I am very good this morning. How are you?
Great.
Welcome to Vintage
Terrific.
Baseball This Week. I'm your
been
host,
working on
Jason
Doc
Gypsy
all morning.
Kladiva. This week's guest is
Fantastic.
Marjorie Adams,
God, I
the
don't
great-granddaughter
even know
of baseball
what
pioneer
I'm
Daniel
doing.
Doc Adams.
Out of the way. Okay.
Marjorie, tell me a little bit about Doc. What's going on with his story? What is his story?
Doc Adams was born in New Hampshire in 1814, and in 1838 he graduated from Harvard Medical School and moved to New York City, where he became a practicing physician, and he started to play baseball with the New York Base Ball Clubs. And in 1845, when the Knickerbocker Base Ball Club was formed, Doc joined about a month later. And until 1862, when he retired, he had a very important influence on the formation of the game.
And what was that influence?
A couple of things. Number one, he made all the balls for the club. There were no baseball manufacturers in New York City in the 1840s. So if Doc hadn't made the balls for the club, what would they have played with?
Okay.
He also supervised the manufacture of all the bats. He'd go around New York City to various furniture turners, someone who turns legs for tables.
Okay.
And he would select the wood, and he would stand over the furniture turner until he had gotten the right taper and length and diameter that Doc wanted. He met the Scottish saddler in Lower Manhattan Island, who showed him how to wrap the balls with yarn.
Okay.
And then he would collect his friends' leftover rubber galoshes and cut the rubber into strips, and that would go over the yarn, and then cut the leather and sew it on top of that.
Now, is he one of the people that designed the lemon peel ball?
Yes, although I think that's a tough call. I think it was probably pretty common that the ball was sewn like that. I've seen a couple of other very primitive-looking baseballs that were sewn sort of straight across, and I don't think they held up very well. They might have even experimented a little bit. I don't know.
Okay.
None of these balls held up very well. They were very light. They were very spongy.
Now, Gary was telling me that Doc Adams may have had something to do with the invention of the shortstop.
Yes, he did. In fact, he is credited with inventing and developing the shortstop position. Originally, it was an outfield position. But what happened is, keep in mind the balls were very light. These balls that Doc made, you could bat them quite a distance. You just couldn't throw them very far. So Doc moved himself, or whoever else might be playing in the outfield, closer in to be a relay position from the outfield and then into the bases. And as baseball equipment improved, then the position moved into where we're used to seeing it today, between second and third base. And that would have been in 1849.
And how is that documented?
It is documented, according to a baseball historian who I trust, in one of the minutes of the Knickerbocker Base Ball Club, and the first time it appears in their records with Doc playing it short. Plus, in 1896, Doc did an interview with the Sporting News magazine.
Okay.
In which he all but gives himself credit for the shortstop position. He says, I was the first to occupy it.
Very cool.
So it's a compilation of bits and pieces of facts.
Okay. And what is your relation to him?
He's my great-grandfather. And it's odd he's only my great-grandfather, but Doc married very late. Doc was 47 when he married in 1861. And my great-grandmother was 16 years his junior. And my grandfather was Doc and Cornelia's last child. He was born in 1874.
Wow.
And my father, my late father, was 40 when I was born. These men aren't in any hurry to have children.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why he's only my great-grandfather. Contrary to what some might say, I'm not 110 years old.
Okay.
Which would make more sense for me to be his great-granddaughter.
Okay. Now, can you tell me a little bit about the find and the auction that is detailed on the website?
Well, it was a fun story. I got an email in early January of 2016 who said, "You're going to get an email from this person. Don't be afraid to open it. Open it." And I was invited to an undisclosed location, which I cannot reveal. I had decided it in effect as far as I'm concerned. And I had to travel quite a distance, handwriting. And they were the originals of Doc's 1857 Laws of Baseball.
Oh, wow.
The man who owned them, well, I practically cried on them. Some of my tear stains might be on them even now. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. It was better than any Christmas I've ever had. I mean, it was just quite a moment. And the man who owned them and subsequently sold them had bought them in about 1998. They were part of a lot from Sotheby's. And they were not the main part of the lot. There were other things that the man was most interested in purchasing. In fact, nobody knew what these documents were. And he looked at them, and he's a big baseball fan. He said, "Oh, this is interesting." He stuck them in a drawer until late 2015, when he said, "I really ought to do something with this." And so that's how it started. And then it sold in April of 2016 for $3.26 million. Third highest paid for any sports memorabilia. Second only to James Naismith's Laws of Basketball and a 1920-something baseball shirt of Babe Ruth's, which was the highest. And they went on display at the Historical Society in Portland, Oregon. And now they are tucked away by an anonymous purchaser.
Okay.
And I hope that this anonymous purchaser will sometime bring them out and let them go on display in New York City. They deserve to be on display in New York City because that's where they were written.
I like it.
And if you consider, I mean, these were written in 1857, but it was in 1856. I think it was the Sunday Mercury was the first time that the term national pastime was used. So these laws were written 1 year after the term national pastime was coined. I think it needs to be in New York City on display.
I agree with you.
So I'm hoping someday the new owner will do that.
Now, have the folks at the Hall of Fame gotten to take a look at this?
Oh, yes, I'm sure they have.
Okay.
I'm sure they have.
Now, you've got a kind of a connection going with the Hall of Fame now in an effort to get Doc Adams enshrined in there.
Yes. I think he should be. Because in addition to creating the shortstop position, in the Laws of Baseball, Doc was the one who did the calculation for 90 feet between bases. Up until that point, it was 42 paces.
Okay.
And 15 paces from home plate to the pitcher's base. It was not called mound back then. It was pitcher's base.
Now, how do we have documentation that it was Doc that did it?
Well, it's in his handwriting.
Okay.
In the Laws of Baseball. And additionally, going back to this interview in Sporting News in 1896, he says very clearly in there that he talks about the laws, and he said, the bases I set at 90 feet. And the distance from home plate to pitcher's base, he set at 45 feet.
Okay.
It changed a couple of times until they finally settled on 60 feet, 6 inches, which I think is what it is now.
Whether it be the names of the positions or what have you?
Well, the names were pretty much what they are now. There were no gloves. The players were sort of trained to catch the ball as if they were catching an egg, two-handed.
Okay.
That doesn't mean they didn't get injuries, but remember the ball was still very light.
Mm-hmm.
So, and also it was an underhand pitch. Also, one of the things of the Knickerbockers, when they were formed in September of 1845 and they wrote their rules, they outlawed a common practice called plugging or soaking.
Okay.
Which meant you could get a runner out by hitting him with the ball. They outlawed that.
Okay.
I mean, could you consider most bat and ball games were primarily played by children? men were just beginning to get into it on any regular basis. So a small child can hit another small child with a ball and not do much injury. And in the laws of baseball, catching a ball on the first bound, that was a rule that Doc hated. He tried to outlaw it, but they wouldn't go along with it. And there were a couple of reasons. The main reason was a lot of these clubs that were attending the 1857 convention, they were new. They had new, inexperienced players. And catching a ball with one hand is much harder on the hands.
Okay.
And if you're running to catch it on the fly, that can be very hard when you're trying to do it with two hands. Much easier when you're catching it on the first bounce. So Doc was not able to eliminate that rule. And it did not pass, I don't think, till 1865, and I think 1866 was the first season that it was finally outlawed and you had to catch the ball on the fly. And he just felt it made the game more manly.
Okay.
And a lot of people agreed with him. They just couldn't get everybody to agree with him.
Wow.
I mean, if anyone who's listening were to go back in time to 1857 and see this game, they would recognize baseball. Absolutely. They would absolutely recognize it as baseball, especially in 1857 when you had 90 feet between bases. I think some elements of the game might look a little different to them, but it's also important, and this is one of my favorite things in the laws of baseball that Doc wrote. He wrote in there in 1857, no gambling by anyone involved with the game, be it a player or a scorekeeper, nobody, no gambling.
What would a penalty be if a person was caught gambling?
Oh, I think they would have been thrown out of the game.
Okay.
I'd have to look it up. But as early as, there were penalties in the very first, one of the first games that the Knickerbockers played in June of 1846. The scorecard for that game still exists. They played against the New York Baseball Club. And a player by the name of Davis on the New York Baseball Club was charged 6 cents for swearing.
Okay.
So this was a gentleman's game. This was not a bunch of rowdies. It got rowdy later. But the early clubs, they were gentlemen. This was for leisure. This was for exercise. This was for fun. Especially in the early days when they didn't have anybody else to play against. I mean, for the first 5 years that the Knickerbockers were in existence, there were really no other clubs to play against. They really only had themselves.
Okay. Now, does he talk about any relationship that he had with Henry Chadwick? No,
oddly enough. He does not. I know they knew each other and probably knew each other very well.
Okay.
In fact, in 1875, there was a reunion game of the Knickerbocker Base Ball Club. And Doc came. He came down from Ridgefield, where he was living. And he was 61 at the time. And he played in that game. And Henry Chadwick was the scorekeeper, the umpire, rather.
Oh, wow.
Henry Chadwick was the umpire. And I have 2 letters written to Doc from Henry Chadwick.
Wow. Now, are those available anywhere to be read?
They're on our website, www.docadamsbaseball.org. They should be on our website.
Okay.
They were both written in 1894.
Okay.
For anyone who has read any history of baseball that mentions Henry Chadwick, there's always a famous quote where Chadwick says, baseball never was like Topsy. It never had no fodder. It just growed up. Well, that's in the letter to Doc Adams, and it's probably the first time he wrote it. I can't prove it, but that goes back to 1894. I think he is said to repeat that line in the early 1900s before he died.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, Chadwick's Book of Rules, the Beatles book, I have it here, from 1860, he mentions Dr. Adams right in the forward of the book. So they knew each other.
Right.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Henry Chadwick, didn't start in baseball till about 1856. So Doc had already been playing a number of years.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got the book right here. And it's right in the forward where he mentions Doc.
Very good.
And what he owes to him.
So what can our listeners do to help you get him into the Hall of Fame?
Well, we have an online petition, and we do not contact anybody. We do not capture email addresses. We don't do anything like that. We just have an online petition, which, of course, they can sign.
Now,
I have until 2020. The next vote is 2020. And
now, how does that vote work? Because, I mean, he's obviously been out of the game a long time.
Yes.
What committee does that go through?
That's the Veterans Committee. They changed the rules 2 years ago. He was on the ballot in 2015. It was his first time on the ballot with 9 other gentlemen. Doc got the most votes of anybody on the ballot, but he missed the minimum by 2 votes. He needed 12. He got 10.
Oh, wow.
And at the time, the interval between that committee meeting was 3 years. Well, the following year, the Hall of Fame changed the intervals to 5 years. So the next vote will be 2020. And after that, it will be 2030. It'll be a 10-year interval. And I will be gathered to my ancestors by then.
Okay.
I'll be sitting with Doc, asking him all the questions that I have. So I've got to get it done in 2020.
Yeah, we got to.
So anybody who wants to help, I'm for it.
We got to get you to see him actually in the hall.
Oh no, that's what I'm living for.
Very
and
good.
It won't be 2030. It better not be, because I'll be very cranky for the next 10 years if that's what happens. You ain't seen nothing. You ain't seen nothing yet.
Now,
no.
Marjorie, is there anything that we have left out that you would like to include?
Yes, there is. I have a quote from Doc from the interview. The very early days of the Knickerbocker baseball team were really tough. They had nobody to play against, and they were playing primarily in the Elysian Fields in Hoboken, New Jersey, so they'd have to take a ferry boat over from Manhattan Island. It wasn't an easy trip. It took time. And so attendance was really bad. And Doc, by 1847, was president of the club, and it was left to him to get the players over there. And at every dinner, he would lecture them, and he would talk about his frustrations of coming to Hoboken to play, and there would only be 2 or 3 other members present. And there's a line from the interview that I want to read as a takeaway for the listeners. I had to employ all my rhetoric to induce attendance, and often thought it useless to continue the effort. But my love for the game and the happy hours spent at the Elysian Fields led me to persevere. He loved this game. And many historians have said to me, it is because of Doc and his love of the game in those very early days that the game survived at all. Because he made the equipment, because he got the members to come out and play. He was the one between 1846 and 1851 that really kept the game going. And all credit must be given to him for that, his enthusiasm for the game.
Now, with his enthusiasm like this, why haven't we heard about him sooner?
You have to know the family. He came from an old Puritan background. No boasting, no self-promotion. That's just unseemly. So we have almost nothing in Doc's handwriting, and we have nothing in Doc's handwriting that talks about baseball. Not a thing.
So he's a pretty modest man.
Very modest. He left the game in 1862. He'd gotten married the previous year, and his wife was just about to have their first child. And about 6 weeks after he resigned from the Knickerbockers, she lost that baby. And it almost killed her. And in 1888, Doc did his undergraduate work at Yale. And in 1888, Yale printed up an alumni magazine, for lack of a better term. And alumni were asked to send in a little autobiography, which Doc did. He makes no mention of baseball, not one word, but he does say, my marriage was the crowning achievement of my life. So that tells you a great deal about the man. He loved this game of baseball, of which he was such a pioneer and contributing member, but his wife and his family was more important to him. That's why we don't know anything.
He sounds like a very good man.
I think so. I've spent the morning rereading letters written to Doc by his father. I have about 150 of these that were transcribed by my great aunt, Doc's eldest daughter. And I've been rereading them this morning, and it just permeates it.
Now, do you think because of his Puritan upbringing, and it sounds like lifestyle, that's where the gentleman's game came from? That's why there wasn't the gambling. That's why there wasn't the swearing or anything like that.
Oh, yes. His father, Doc's father, is almost more interesting than Doc in some ways. We know more about him. His father was a frequent orator in support of the temperance movement and the abolitionist movement. His father wrote one of the first arithmetic textbooks in this country. It was published in 1801 and in publication through 1864. His father was a farmer, a pillar of his congregational church. So that's what I mean about Doc's very strict upbringing and deeply religious upbringing, although the indications we have, Doc was not as religious as his father, but a lot of it rubbed off in terms of how one behaved, even if he was not practicing it the way his father did. And I think reading these letters, as I say, I'm just almost halfway through them again. I've only read them about 15 times.
Now, looking at his lifestyle, I mean, we've talked about baseball, we've talked about religion, we've talked about the family. What did Doc do for a living?
Well, he was a practicing physician in New York. His specialty was stammerers, which I find fascinating. I'm beginning to think his younger sister stammered. Without going into all the details, these family letters talk about her health issues and her nerves. She might have stammered.
Okay.
And he was also appointed a vaccine physician for the city of New York in 1841, and he earned $400 a year. He volunteered his time with the New York Dispensary in New York, taking care of especially cholera epidemics, volunteering his time. And then his father died in 1864. His father was also a doctor. And the following year, Doc gave up the practice of medicine, and they moved, and he became a bank president.
Okay.
And he did that until about 1888, when he really did retire, and then did nothing. And he served one term in the state legislature in Connecticut, where they live, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. He was first treasurer of the library in Ridgefield, Connecticut. He served on the Town Improvement Association. He totally gave up medicine, completely.
Now,
I don't think he ever wanted to be a doctor.
Now, during the Civil War, did he help out as a physician?
None that I know of. I don't think he did. They were married in 1861, about 1 month after Fort Sumter. Okay. And I have a letter that Doc wrote in 1894 to my grandfather about their anniversary, and he's describing their wedding day and how the city was all decorated with bunting, because this was right after Fort Sumter. Doc was 47, so nothing was required of him. Right. In terms of the war itself. Okay. When there were younger men who could serve in the war, he could stay in New York and still be a physician and still help with the poor. Now, how do you think he would feel about today's game? The way everything's being played, whether it be mine. He'd be astonished. He'd be blown away. And as a matter of fact, in this 1896 interview, he says, we pioneers never expected the game to be as widespread, I forget the word that he uses, as it is today. They never expected the game to grow to what it became. We look at the early game, and it was more of a relaxed, as you said, you're out there for exercise, you're out there for camaraderie and getting to know your neighbor. Yep. And now we're starting to put in a pitch clock to speed things up. Are we getting away from Doc Adams' original intentions? Yes. But I think in today's world, if we didn't, the game would be in bigger trouble than it might already be. Okay. In terms of its popularity. I will say that I go to a lot of vintage baseball games. They're all over the country. So anyone who's listening, There's lots of different ways to find out if there's a local club in your area. They're always looking for players, for one thing. But I love watching vintage baseball. It has a purity to it that I just find endearing. And the enthusiasm of the players for the game in its purest form is very infectious. And beautiful summer day, and you're, 10 feet away, 15 feet away from home plate. How good is that?
Right.
It doesn't get any better than that. And do you know why it's called home plate?
Why?
Because one of the rules was that it was to be a round plate, either at enameled metal or painted wood.
Okay.
And it was round, like a dinner plate. So it got to be called home plate for that reason.
Okay.
So those who are listening, next time they call it home plate, that's a very old-fashioned term they're using.
There you go. I like it.
Isn't that fun?
It is. It is.
So there's some holdovers from the old days. I love watching a ball game, modern ball. I love modern ball. I love the sounds. I love the energy. That sound of the ball hitting the bat is one of the sweetest sounds in the world. And I don't want to get too bogged down with all the nuances of the play, because on some level it would detract from my enjoyment of what I'm watching. I know just enough about the modern game to watch it and enjoy it. But I don't want to get bogged down with RBIs and all that stuff. To me, all the numbers just sort of detract from my joy of watching the game.
You have the same pure heart your great-grandfather had.
Oh, I don't know. I doubt it. Huh. Can I quote you on that, Jason?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Marjorie, I want to thank you for sharing this great history.
Wouldn't believe that statement.
Marjorie, I want to thank you for sharing all this great early history.
Well, thank you. This was fun. This was fun. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to Vintage Baseball this week. I am your host, Jason Gypsy Kladiva. The show was produced by Mackinac Public Media and made available to public radio stations around the world by the Public Radio Exchange. Until next week, stay dry, and I'll see you in the frame.
I forget, this is here for a game. Somebody got one like right here. From the way they described it.